So just a little bit of background. I consider myself a designer, although some designers say I'm not a designer because I'm an architect. And I got interested not so much in the solution of products, which I was for a very long time, buildings and so on, but more the question of whether we were being asked to design the right things. And I woke to the question that is our built environment, for example, dependent on great architects or enlightened clients who do things differently. And I began to realize there's an opportunity and a need to work in creating enlightened clients. So the work I'll talk about is about design in the context of how we make decisions. And then furthermore, it will be in the context of the public sector. Now, for many of you, maybe the public sector doesn't sound very interesting. I've worked in Finland the last 5 years, and it's my mission to make the public sector sexy. So hopefully, it'll be a little more interesting after this. And I think we have a dilemma in Finland, in Europe, I would assume maybe here in Slovenia too, about how we build the future. And will the future be just an extension of the past, which I think that's what we're doing, or will it be a conscious act of designing the future, meaning that we actually can design a different trajectory. And what does that mean? So in terms of the future, I like this Buckminster Fuller quote: the best way to predict the future is actually to design it. I'm trying to underscore the idea that actually we can consciously make decisions that change the trajectory of our history. And so the future does not have to be an extension of the past. Here's a screen capture from June 11, 2013. And I don't know how many of you were watching Greek state TV, but I happened to be watching because it was a very exciting moment. It was the moment that the Greek state TV did this. What it did, it went off the air. This is the way that when we are under pressures to transform, we actually start with the idea that we're going to look at what we have. What are the boxes we're working in today? And then we ask ourselves, what can we do with these boxes? And in there lies, I think, our problem. Because when you start looking at how things are, your only option is either to make one of the boxes smaller, or cut it off, like happened to TV, or make all the boxes smaller, or move the boxes around. And what I'm suggesting is actually we can begin to determine the framework. We don't have to work within the existing framework. So 3 things I want to highlight here. One is, I think we need to redefine the categories. I know this is a very abstract idea, but what I mean about that is when we think about the world, we have categories. We have organizations, silos. We have categories of concepts. There's this and that concept. And we try to innovate from within those. I'm arguing we can come up with new categories. The second is we have to come up with a new logic. We cannot assume that the problems that we have today will be solved by the logics that created them. Right? How can you imagine that you've been applying a logic, it creates a problem, and then you think that same logic can solve it? And the third thing is we have to rethink our social contract. That's different everywhere in Europe. In Finland, we have a social contract which sets the relationship between citizens, the public, other entities, and their expectations. And when those boxes or categories change, we're changing our expectations. And I think we've done very little to none to actually talk about what is the new social contract. So my presentation will try to capture this idea. I know this sounds, and it's formulated in a very boring way, but if P represents the present and F is the future, how do we build a future that's different than just an extension of the past? And then how do we transition things to it? Because you got to realize if you have an idea of how things could be better, you can't just shut things off. Okay? So imagine for a moment you have a better idea about how you would educate your country. You can't send out a memo to people to say, sorry, we're going to close education down for 10 years while we build this fantastic new model. What you need to do is you need to transition. While you have the old, you need to be building the new. And it's a bit like changing the tire on a car while you're driving. So what is F, and how do we do that transition? It's a double design task, I would say. Now, if you look at what's happening in Europe, this is a lot of what's happening in Europe. I would say while the symptoms are different, the underlying condition is the same. So in Istanbul, we might have protests around public space planning. In Athens, it might be about the TV station cutting public spending. In Madrid, it might be about the future of youth. And these protests, this displeasure with how things are, with the categories we're working within, is not just a question of citizens, it goes at the heart of politics. And so this same riot is also happening in Parliament here in Italy. We have tensions, conflicts that are emerging because what we have and what we need, we haven't found a way to bring those together. And one of the underlying things is quite simply this. This is the level of debt of countries. And as you can see, over time it's growing. Now some countries may be less indebted than others, but the trend is the same for everybody. So the path we're on is not sustainable. The question is not about how do we do less or make something smaller with less money. The question is actually how do we redesign things. So I'm very concerned about the future of governments, and I'll use the term government in a very broad way to kind of encompass the whole public sector. Because they're not set up to innovate. They're set up to administer. They're set up to make sure that permitting happens, that the regulatory frameworks are in place, that things are abided by them. And when they do talk about, when the public sector talks about innovation, it's usually actions to help the commercial or other sectors be innovative. How do we fund innovation elsewhere? Almost never is it about innovating how government goes about its own business, changing fundamentally the culture and the business model of government, so to speak. And so that's why I think this opportunity for design comes. I believe that governments have huge intractable problems, climate change, health, education, that they're not equipped anymore. They used to be equipped, but not equipped anymore to deal with. And that this new complexity needs a new logic. And I believe that design has something to offer in this equation. And so I believe there's an opportunity to bring these together. Don't get me wrong, I think the community of designers and the community of government are as far apart as you can get. In fact, when I go over here, they ask me who are all those boring people in suits. And when I go over up there, they tell me who are all those freaks in black. So when I talk about design, I'm not talking about design of services per se, although I'll get into a few examples, or design of products, objects. I'm not even talking about design of organizations, although I'm talking more about that. I'm fundamentally talking about designing the engine that can deliver. How do you design the preconditions in the public sector so that it can begin to behave differently? You cannot assume that an organization can produce different things if it hasn't fundamentally changed as an organization. All right, so where does this all emerge from? Well, let me posit a few ideas. These ideas I've been playing around for quite a while, so some of you may be half familiar with them or fully familiar, so forgive me. But one of them is, I think, the structures, the categories of government that we have, the silos we have in government, don't fit the world today. You have to understand, take the ministries in Finland. I'll just use Finland as an example because that applies to every single country. The ministries we have emerged out of a historical context that has since changed. My biggest question has always been is why do we have the Ministry of Transportation and Telecommunication? This ministry to me does not make much sense. Now, if we went back to the 1800s in a kind of fictional land of Finland, when Finland was being built, I'm sure somebody thought, well, we're building train lines, it might make sense to put phone lines. And we're building roads, and it might make sense to put mail on ponies on the road. So it made sense back then to have an organization that would coordinate how people moved and how information moved. But you and I know that the way information moves in social media obeys none of the laws of highways. So why is the same organization dealing with these two issues? So we're dealing with a world that's very different, and yet we're bound by the logics of a singular organization. The other example is to look at the flip side. What are some of the major issues we're dealing with? climate change, sustainability agendas. In Finland, we don't have a ministry for that, like we don't have in most of Europe. So if I want to do sustainable development, make cities that are, say, carbon neutral, what do? I need to go to the Ministry of Trade and Employment to get the energy bit because they own energy. I need to go to the Ministry of Housing because they own housing. I need to go to the Ministry of the Environment because they own the environment. I need to go to the Ministry of Telecommunication and Transportation because they own the mobility bit. And the list goes on. And I learned that actually these organizations have all very different cultures, different incentives, and they have incentives to meet their internal objectives. So I'm pushing the argument here a little bit, but I'm arguing that innovating these big themes that we need to deal with is not going to happen because of our institutions. It will happen in spite of our institutions. The other idea I want to put on the table is this idea that actually what we're innovating has changed. What we need to innovate has changed a bit. We're all familiar with the idea of a product as an innovation. We're not very familiar with the idea of a system as an innovation. And more our challenges are about systems, about wholes. And the problem is you may make many innovative parts. I lived 20 years in the States. I did a lot of work in healthcare, and I can tell you for sure that in the US, there's tons of innovation in healthcare. New procedures, new pills, new drugs, you name it. Guess what? They don't all add up to a more innovative healthcare system. Many good ideas don't add up to a great idea. So how you innovate the whole is actually a different kind of challenge than how do you innovate a part. And we're transitioning. The pressures on governments are more about the whole than the part. So that's the second kind of challenge, which is connected to the first one, because our institutions deal with parts. So I'm going to tell a story I tell way too frequently, but it captures the basic essence of what I'm trying to talk about. We're talking about 1950s Denmark, a small town in Denmark, and city council, the leadership of the city, was very worried that none of the citizens were going to this municipal swimming facility anymore. Why weren't people going to the city swimming pool? So they went to look at the building, and they realized the building is in terrible condition. Windows were broken, heating wasn't working, and it was clear to everybody they needed a new building. So they hired an architect, and the architect came a few weeks later at a meeting like this with city council and citizens, and everybody was waiting for the first solution. What would the new concept for the building look like that would solve our problem? And what the architect did was actually show this. This was a bus schedule. And he said, you're right, the building is in terrible condition. But that's not the fundamental reason why people are not coming anymore. The reason people aren't coming is you changed the public bus schedule last year, not to coincide with open hours. People can't get to the building. So this is the problem. It's the problem of having boxes that don't meet today's needs. So you have somebody innovating the bus schedule without thinking how it affects the swimming facility. So we talk a lot about, before you begin to solve these issues, you need to understand what's the architecture of the solution. How is this issue connected to that issue, connected to this? Otherwise, you're going to frame the wrong question. So I try to put it in a framework that is decision-making, how you frame a problem over time. So just bear with me. Imagine this is the phase when we all know there's a problem, but we don't quite know what that problem is. And over there is we've defined what the solution is, and we have a desired outcome for this. This might be in an individual or in an organization. There'll be different phases that begin to determine how should we frame this problem. Now the problem as a designer is I worked at the solution end. I used to get briefs. And I would argue more and more the briefs we're dealing with are asking the wrong question. They're asking us, design a swimming pool, when in fact, we should be doing the bus schedule. So what do? You take the wrong problem and just make it pretty. We'll have a beautiful building that no one will go to, but it will be beautiful. Or you work backstream and help clients become more enlightened about what is the problem, what is the architecture of all the problems they have, and begin helping them frame the right issue. So for me, this is shaping products and services, and this is about framing decision making. We cannot focus just on services and products. I'm very pleased that in Finland, for example, the public sector has began to ask itself, what is the role of service design? There's tons to improve. But if we just stay there, the problem is we'll improve the wrong questions. We'll improve the wrong services. We'll make dying more pleasant. What we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, what are the services that we need? Now, if we just do this, we'll have the best new theoretical frameworks with no impact, no new services. If we just do services, we'll have the most beautiful wrong solutions. So I'm arguing design needs to get involved at both ends of this spectrum. It is not about competing, it's about having the right complement. So I'll sum up this part before I get into a few examples, is by suggesting that today's challenge is fundamentally not so much that we don't know we have issues, it's we actually don't know how to think about it. And here, again, I think there's a role for design. These are my two favorite figures. I'll talk them quite quickly through. We're talking in 2008, the subprime collapse. The bubble in the US, financial bubble in the US that collapsed, that created basically the economic, or the first wave of the economic problems we've had here. And I'm showing them to illustrate how our decision-making structure, the basic structure of how we make decisions in the public sector is fundamentally flawed, in my mind. So the way we build things is we have basically two parts. We have politicians and we have public servants. Politicians are charged with creating visions. It is their job to think, what is the future? What's the better future? And it is their job to help them build it. So in a certain way, I'm oversimplifying, they have the technical knowledge and they have the vision, so to speak. The problem is it's on both ends. And I want to be really clear. My argument here is not about intelligence, it's not about political disposition, are you left or right wing, it's about this way of making decisions. At the vision bit, we actually don't have the tools to understand what creates a vision. A vision is not just, ooh, that's a nice place. A vision is much more. And you have to have the ability to understand the interconnected nature of the world. And how you build it cannot happen anymore in a kind of master plan approach. And I'll try to explain both. So what does Bush say? Bush comes out in 2008 and talks to the world public for the very first time about what just happened. And he says a few things that in my mind are very interesting. First, he starts his speech by saying, it turns out, it's my favorite opening statement of all times. The man at the top of the pyramid, the man with the most strategic perspective, you would think, didn't know. I just found out. So it turns out there is a system. And what does he do? He does this. He uses his arms to try to give shape, the way designers give shape to problems, to something that he can't quite grasp that's in the material. And then he says that when there is a problem in one part of the system, it's not just limited to that part of the system, it affects the whole system, and he ends in shock, it affects people. So it's quite stunning to realize that the top of the pyramid does not have the strategic perspective on some issues. It doesn't completely understand the complex and interconnected nature of the problems it's dealing with. And it doesn't realize how things that are, let's say, in a kind of immaterial world affect the material world. I don't blame them. It's really difficult. You actually need the skills to navigate this world. So what happens over here? A few days later, Waxman grills Alan Greenspan in Congress. What just happened? And Alan Greenspan, by all measures, was considered a monetary genius. So we can put any question about intelligence aside. This guy knew what was going on. And actually, he says, I knew what this thing was. I had a model, the way an architect might have a model, or a designer might have a model about a concept. I actually had a model, an economic model, of how I believed, and this is my favorite thing, he says, how the world works. It's one of these Darth Vader moments. And he said, I had data for 40 years to tell me that my view of the world was correct. Until one day, I realized it was flawed. So the problem with us is, the smarter you are, the easier it is to rationalize anything. And we have to be very careful with the idea that we can rationalize the world, and then act on the world. And what I'm going to suggest is actually, as we try to bring reason to the world, we need to act. And the way of acting is a way of bringing reason. These two things are interconnected. So I want to reestablish, today's problems can't be solved by the logics that produce them. This is paraphrasing Einstein, not that he needs to be paraphrased, but it is. So the structure we have, the conditions by which we make decisions in the public sector, the logics, the frameworks, and so on, will keep producing the same kinds of solutions. We need to change that. So I'm going to do a little bit of history with you, if that's okay, and suggest that we've gone through one evolution trajectory, and we have a question about whether we want to create a second evolution trajectory. 2013 is this year, and we've prospered a lot. We have to understand, we have lots of problems, but we've prospered a lot by a certain way of doing things, which is fundamentally an industrial way of doing, an economy that's built around industrial concepts. And so you have to ask yourself, where did this come? Because if you go back in time, there was a time when we were in caves hitting each other with sticks. So something happened along the way that brought a lot of wealth and well-being. Many people would argue 1850, right? This is more or less the birth of the Industrial Revolution. That has really brought growth and well-being to lots. We benefited tremendously from this. Now, it's a bit deceiving because it wasn't a revolution. It didn't happen overnight. And actually, it happened kind of like water boiling over time, and then there was a tipping point. So you have to ask yourself, well, what brought about the Industrial Revolution? How do we come from caves to suddenly having machines? I would argue 1550, the scientific revolution. Suddenly there was an explosion of knowledge that gave us the tools to understand the behavior of our environment, and furthermore, how to act on it. And once we knew that, we could engineer things, which allowed us the ability to build machines, ability to produce things in mass quantities. So then you have to ask yourself, hold on, we were in caves. How do we wake up one morning and suddenly have all this science? So, February 12th, 12 o'clock, 12:02, more or less. What happened then? A gentleman called Fibonacci published a book. And he dealt with this problem. Do this division, okay? And I'll be back in a few months, and you'll still be working on this. If you divide that number by that number. So you have to understand, Europe used Roman numerals until 12:02, February 12th, around noon. This is a very difficult thing to do, right? And trust me, if any of you is trying to do this, you're cheating. What you're doing is you're translating these new numbers into our numeric system, then you're doing the math, and then you're translating back to Romans. But you have to understand, back then there was no alternative. You had to work within this logic, within this framework. I believe it's 54. It's a pretty simple bit of math to do. So there was a transition that was going on from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals. Arabic numerals is what we use now. And what Fibonacci did was publish a book that helped popularize that, so helped really spread it. And when you go to Arabic numerals, what you realize is this is easy. Much more complex stuff is easy, right? You cannot do VAT in the government, like tax, using this. So even the concept of a VAT would not exist if we had Roman numerals. We'd have to think of it slightly differently. Percentages, fractions, forget it. So he popularized this. And what does that happen? It means that when you're looking at the stars and you're wondering why things move a certain way, for the very first time you can have mathematical equations that can predict where things are going to move. And for the first time you can manage numeric complexity on a level that before was impossible. Right? And the moment you do that, you understand why your environment is behaving the way it is. You can simplify them and codify them in math, basically. And once you understand why it's behaving the way it is, you can begin to act upon it. So I would argue that this very simple transformation had a chain reaction that brought about the scientific revolution, an explosion of knowledge, and many other things. We have a problem now, though. That's plateauing. We're not benefiting anymore from that explosion of knowledge. This was a map of the war on Afghanistan that a senior US general presented. And then halfway through his presentation, he chuckled and he said, by the time we figure this map out, the war in Afghanistan will be won. This was the way the US Army was trying to figure out how to win the war. Right? And you can see, they're trying to deal with a new kind of complexity. is the interconnection between many things. This is kind of what Bush was trying to do, right? He didn't realize if you have tribal problems, it might affect the whole system and tribesmen, right? That was sort of his argument. So there is a recognition that there is a kind of systemic interconnected nature to things, and there's a need for new tools to deal with that. So I'm arguing the next kind of transition that we'll have a connection to design, we'll have a connection to our ability to visualize complexity. All right, I want to go through really quickly 3 quick projects. One is a project I did before I came back to Finland in the US, looking at healthcare. And we looked at a condition that's called stroke. A stroke is basically a disruption of blood flow to the brain. Right? So if you have something that's blocking the blood from going to your brain, that part of the brain will be affected. There's no oxygen going to it, no nutrients. And a little bit like you and me, we can swim underwater, hold our breath, but after a while, you can maybe swim 10 seconds, 30 seconds underwater, but you can't swim 10 minutes. So at some point, if you don't restore the blood to the brain, it will die. And you may lose your ability to talk, to walk, or you may even die. Right? So in stroke care in the US and in Europe, the idea is as quickly as you can, open up the vessel and let the blood flow back. And if you can do that within that window of opportunity, people can be fine. I'm simplifying, but that's basically the gist. So I won't go over all of the science behind this, but you basically have 3 hours from the moment you have a stroke to get to the hospital and get a drug into your veins that dissolves the clot. And you have to trust me, that means 30 minutes to get to the hospital, which is stuff that happens at the hospital end. Okay? So here too, we're looking at a system, and what stakeholders and decision makers thought was we have a perfect system. The reason why we're not getting improvement is that we're not getting people into the system. Right? So we need to get more people. It's just about efficiency. Everything's perfect if we just get everybody in. So you'll see a lot of campaigns that are focused on call the hospital immediately. Because the belief was that you and I were not calling the hospital, we're waiting 5 days, and then we go to the hospital, sort of limping, and they're saying, I'm sorry, that part of the brain's gone. So get everybody in, and we have a perfect system. And we felt that there was something wrong with this. So the first question we asked ourselves, do we know where people live? And do we know where hospitals are? And do we even know if the population is within 30 minutes of hospitals? What if all the hospitals are over here, and everybody lives over there? And even if you have the perfect system there, people can't get there. So we did that. We took a map of the US, we put census data, the darker parts are where people live, and you'll see soon there's little hospitals. Well, they're not little, but they're little on the map. And we can figure out how many people live more or less within 30 minutes. Now to keep things simple, what I'm going to show you is a map that shows you 30 miles. In the US you drive 60 miles an hour, so half of that is 30 miles. And imagine that you're not a car, but you fly like a bird, straight line. So this is a very crude approximation, right? And so what we get is a map that looks kind of like this. If you live in the white zones, you can theoretically get to the hospital in time. So if you look at the curves, we're talking about more or less 50% of the population is theoretically within range. Right? So we know the number is actually going to be smaller because I don't think anybody flies, and even if you do fly, you're not going to fly in a straight line. Okay? All right, so we already see a kind of a problem. So it's not enough that everybody calls, because maximum half the population isn't even eligible for care. All right, so Massachusetts realized this problem. They realized that actually we have a coverage problem. So what did? They did this. They said, well, one way to solve it is to make every single hospital in the state a stroke hospital. Make sure that every little place can cure this. So they put a bit of policy to make 72 hospitals in the state of Massachusetts stroke hospitals. The woman over there in the rural hospital, the CEO of that, she cried when I was visiting her. And she cried because she said, the state has put a bit of policy in place that is forcing me to hire a neurologist, somebody who understands the brain, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for those very few stroke patients we get once in a while. Because we don't have that many people. We actually have other kinds of problems. So when I have limited resources, should I just be waiting for the few patients, or should I be doing something else? Now, when you do the same analysis, you notice that within 15 miles, about 100% of the population is within reach. So you say, fantastic, policy is working, right? On paper, this concept of reaching your whole population is working. Now it's just a matter of getting people to call. But you'll notice one problem. There's parts of the map that aren't covered by white. This is Cape Cod, and this is called the Berkshires. And if you've been to the US and to Massachusetts, these are the two most popular travel destinations for people. So census data is great until you leave your home. The moment you leave your home, because it counts, where do you live? But what if you're not there when you have a stroke? So how much is moving populations affecting this problem? No one had really looked at this. So we said, okay, let's look at an extreme condition. Because we can't look at all problems, but we can look at boundary conditions that begin to put scale to this issue. So let's go back to the map of the US, and let's just pick one issue that we know is completely outside of care. So we looked at national parks in the US, and we looked only at national parks that I guarantee there is no hospital within 30 minutes. Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Yellowstone, so on and so on. No hospital, 30 minutes. Okay? How many people go there? It's about 100 million Americans every year go to these places completely outside of the care. How much is this impacting the system? So is it enough to say, oh, when you're in Yosemite, all you need to do is call because we have a perfect system? The second thing we realized is by looking at data from the Veterans Administration, these are former soldiers in the US Army, they had collected over many, many, many years, when did soldiers have a stroke? And they realized that they tended to have strokes in the summer. And so there was a huge spike in the summer of stroke. So you actually have a yearly cycle to this. And most people are likely to go away centers of care in the summer. So as populations are most likely to move in the summer, they're also most likely to get a stroke. What is the combined effect of that? And now let's come back to our little circles. So this is the analysis I did before. This is Boston. It turns out that all the stroke hospitals are across the street from each other. And this covers about 75% of Massachusetts because most people live in Boston. We worked with the Department of Transportation to get actual traffic data. So you know we're not birds, and you know the roads are squiggly, and you know we have traffic lights. So what's 30 minutes? So I'll show a map that has two lines. The first line shows actual 30 minutes under normal driving. And the second map is the one that we're most interested in, is in the morning, when you have most traffic. And why are we interested in that? Because stroke has a yearly cycle, but also has a daily cycle. You and I are most likely to have a stroke in the morning. Because I've been sleeping at night like this, and I have a little clock, and as I get out of bed, two things happen. My posture changes, and that clock goes poof. And then, because I'm coming to talk to you guys, my blood pressure rises, and it goes doom, and it stays in there. Okay? So the change in posture and the change in blood pressure makes it most likely that we'll get a clot in our brain. This is when you can travel the least. So let's look at this map. Yellow is 30 minutes under normal driving, and red is 30 minutes under morning traffic when you're most likely to have a stroke. So you realize when stroke is most likely to happen, coverage is really, really small. And what we realized is when you extrapolate this to the US, only about 10% of Americans are even theoretically within reach of a hospital, even if every American called immediately. 10% on a drug that is 12% effective. So we are improving a system that has a maximum ceiling of 1.2% outcomes improvement. We're using tons of political capital and financial capital to drive a system that we're saying is perfect. All we need to do is get patients in, but we haven't asked some very basic questions. And we realized the solution was something completely different. And I'll just say, there is no 3-hour patient. You either have 5 minutes and your brain's gone, or 24 hours. The average is 3 hours, but we can't take a statistical approach to populations. And when this drug was approved in 1996, we didn't have the imaging capability to actually understand what's happening to the brain over time. So we're using logics in the past that don't apply to the future. All right, so we're talking about what is the architecture of the solution of this problem set. We took that same logic to Helsinki, and we try to build a carbon neutral development. How do you do the city so that it's carbon neutral? Well, we know it's a highly integrated problem. It's yes about building, it's about energy policy, it's about planning, it's about having those things integrated, but it's about consumption too. I may have zero energy house, but if I eat 5 kilos of Brazilian meat a day, I'm creating carbon somewhere else. So I need to look at the total boundary of carbon. And yes, it's about the building, but ultimately, this is the architecture of the solution. To make the building behave differently, we actually had to change the fire codes in Finland to allow for wood to be used in building materials, because wood is much more carbon friendly. We had to change the investment partnership between the different people that we were working with, the investors, because we had 200 apartments and an office in this complex. Because by sharing resources, we come up with a more efficient model, but it also means that then our property lines and what we own is different. So that needs to change, and we need to change many, many other things, activate citizens, etc. No one is doing this work. No one is doing the work of actually figuring out what is the sum effect of many different projects. Activating citizens. Developers were telling us that they know what people want. But we're asking people, and they're saying, developers are only offering us one solution. Every house in Finland looks the same. How is that possible? So of course, if you're in a market and you're only offering one solution, that's what people will buy. So we worked with citizens, and we realized there's a desire to have very different kinds of housing. What are the new trade-offs? It gives you new kinds of specs. We had to shift the conversation from cost to investment. Everybody is thinking about how much this costs, but no one's thinking about long-term investment and actually what's a better way to use resources. I won't get into this, but it's another aspect. And we had to realize that there are traditions in our culture that are going to help us. We only have to rediscover them. So this is the sauna tradition, you know, maybe weird to some. We find it very enjoyable. And we go in a room and we get all hot and sweaty. Now, this tradition has been privatized in the last 10, 20, 30 years, meaning that every apartment in Helsinki is now sold with its own sauna. We used to do public sauna, now it's private sauna. So what would happen in a block like this? You'd have 200 saunas, go on every day, heated for 3 hours, so I can have a sauna for 15 minutes. From an energy perspective, it makes no sense. So we got the developers to sell apartments with no saunas. And we reintroduced this old tradition of public sauna. So we have the benefit of one sauna on instead of 200. So the energy equation is simple. But more importantly, these guys meet. And when these guys meet, they begin to create social relationships. And it's much more likely that this guy is going to check on that guy's mother to see how they're doing. And you're building more resilient societies. And I actually think that when you build more resilient societies, they're also more sustainable in the long term. And I'll end this case on this. So I told you fire codes. So Finland was a predominantly concrete industry building. Concrete uses tons of energy, has a big carbon footprint. We could use wood, because each time a tree grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide and actually stores it. And when you cut it down, you're storing carbon dioxide in a building, and you grow a new tree, which absorbs more. So the more you build out of wood, the greater is your ability. And Finland could actually be carbon neutral quite quickly. But fire codes have prevented this from happening. The interesting thing is, in Sweden, they've been building out of wood for 20 years. I'm talking about large-scale structures, not small houses. And this is what I love. You have the same technical data on the table. The Swedes, who are the same like us, we live in the same part of the world, we have the same socioeconomic model, tell us that wood does not burn, and Finns tell us that wood does burn. So it's a cultural question. It's a cultural challenge. We see risk where Swedes see opportunity. So this is one of my main points here, is that these innovation challenges are not technical in nature, are not financial in nature, they're purely, deeply cultural in nature. And we were able to change that, and now wood is available in Finland. So I aggravate everybody in Finland by saying the best innovation policy is cultural policy. We have a very technocratic idea of what innovation is. It's gadgets. All right. I'm going to just fly through this because I have about a minute and a half, but I'll just show you some eye candy, or whatever, eye salt, if you don't like it. And what we tried to do was distill this process that I've shown you, both in healthcare and the built environment. These are very lengthy projects, very costly projects. The healthcare project that I showed you, just one little aspect, was a 5-year project. And the problem with that, it doesn't fit the political cycle very well. So by the time you know what you need to do, the context has evolved. So we asked our question, can you do that process in a week? And what we start with is the basic idea that all we need to really figure out is what is the vision for a better future, and then what are the top 10 things I can do right now to begin that transformation. We built 3 themes, and we brought integrated teams of 8 people with very different perspectives to redesign what this issue could be in Finland. Sustainable development. How could Finland be zero carbon? Education. We apparently have a great education system, but maybe we've improved yesterday's system. and we'll be the last to design tomorrow's. So what would tomorrow's education system look like? How would we rethink that? And thirdly, aging. We have a huge aging crisis. Everyone's freaking out. A lot of needs for services, little tax money. How do we think about this? So 3 strategic questions, bring a design team in, integrated by a designer, and begin to build a future vision for this. We meet with experts in the field, with the minister that owns the problem. On the second day, we actually go in the field. We do some light ethnography. What is it like? What are schools actually like? What are parents actually thinking? And then we have a policy session with the owners of these problems, and I would argue we have a strategic conversation that rarely happens in the public sector. We create the space to begin to debate and discuss things on different terms. And one of the comments we got from a high-ranking politician is, I can't believe you did it in a week. And the basic notion was, look, I have a strategy team that's been working on these issues. It's been in place for 4 years. It's come to about half of the ideas that you came up. It doesn't have an idea of what the total vision is. And by the time they're done, the political cycle's gone. Or they've used all of their political capital to drive the process, and there's no interest to deliver. So we need to get the clock speed on this so that it's like a real-time sketch. And we end with dinners. Dinners are great, help socialize people. And I think you need to start by socializing people, and then you start socializing ideas, and then you can start dating ideas, and then you can marry ideas. But I don't think you can start by having a proposition of marriage first. And then we take that into a broader sphere. All right, so if you believe in this process, the question is how does the public sector do this? It needs this new culture to happen. And so we put a program together to place designers in the public sector. We don't believe you can do it as a consultancy. The change has to happen from within. So 2 very quick stories and then I'll end. This is the heart of innovation in Europe, for those of you who've been to Brussels. This is the hallway where innovation policy is crafted. If you look really hard, there's a person at the end of the hallway. But I wonder whether this environment is capable of actually thinking in a different way, of disrupting the way that, and unfortunately, I know it's a physical environment, but that represents quite a bit, the kind of ideologies and the fundamental cultural values. So we wanted to place people like this, like Jana, in social services. So Jana worked on a problem with families with children at risk. And these are the families that have the hardest time reaching the services they need. So this is what happens. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I have a screaming child. I need help from Helsinki Social Services. What do? I go probably online. That's one option. And I Google Helsinki Social Services. And what do? I get a website that tells me how they're organized. Do you think I care? I don't care. And what I care is, how do I get help right now? So we said we need to invert that logic. It's not about telling me who you are. It's about listening better, what I need. And what I need is something like Google. I just put screaming child, and it'll find me the quickest link. So we did a project to put a website up very quickly that tells me if I live in this part of town, there's a Dropbox, this is the person that's available right now, this is his phone number, and then there's a couple other options to connect. The quickest path to get somebody to talk who can help you right now. Right? This was a very big transformation in the logic of the public sector. The other project was putting Sara in Lahti, a smallish town north of Helsinki, and around city planning. What has happened with city planning? More and more master plans are going to court because the top-down vision and the bottom-up resistance to that vision is colliding. And so citizens are taking master plans to court. It is a very expensive way to build cities. It is a terrible way of using your tax euros, and it's a horrible way to build the communities. And so we need to change. So we said, why don't we co-create with citizens what the brief ought to be before we even start the process of planning? So Sara engaged about 1,000 people from this city, 1% of the population. That's quite amazing, right? Not with forms, but with active engagement and tools to understand what motivates and drives them. This is a session I love to show because it's with children. And yes, there's the romantic narrative, the children are our future, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's great. But there's a much more strategic or tactical, actually, one, which is these kids get really excited very quickly about their city. And they go back home, and at dinner they have a conversation with mom and dad about the city. And they suddenly begin to prime parents to think differently. Now, this is a very different way of engaging parents than saying, we're going to have an official forum at City Hall where we're going to tell you, and here's the form. Right? So we need to change the engagement logic. Likewise, we said, we can't expect citizens to come to talk to you in your office. Let's bring your office to where citizens are. Once a month, there's a marketplace. We put up a stall, and we put the best coffee in Lahti right next to the stall, free coffee. People started lining up for that, and they had chance encounter conversations with civil servants that they'd never had before. Because you lowered the barrier for socializing ideas. It wasn't about marriage immediately. And this guy over here, public servant for 30 years, said after this day, I can't believe it. These citizens don't just complain. Yeah, no kidding. Our problem was we just have the complaint box in public service. There is no good ideas box, right? And likewise, these citizens were like, my God, this guy's fantastic. And he's really motivated. I just didn't understand the realities and the pressures that he's dealing with. And by having and socializing this conversation, you began to have a relationship that began to co-create a vision that led to a competition and its outcomes. And the end story is you have a process that is quicker, cheaper, and better. It's as simple as that. So you need to fundamentally disrupt the pattern of behavior, invert logics, and understand what makes relationships happen. I'll end on this. This is my last slide, I really promise, okay? LRC, and I'm going to propose that we could begin discussing LREs. I need to explain. So I was having dinner with an Indian gentleman a few weeks ago in Helsinki, and he said, oh, blah, 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 LRC. I was like, huh? What's LRC? I was like, oh, you don't know. Some business people talk about low-regulated countries. Okay? So I was like, okay, that sounds familiar. It sounds dark and sinister, and yes, there is a whole side of that. That is businesses going into environments where there's not too much regulation, where they can do things they can't do back at home. Okay, that's the dark story. But there is a very positive story, that these are environments that are free to rethink things. So in Finland and Sweden and Denmark, we could go down the country list, I cannot touch this table here, because there are 15 ministries that own it, 572 regulations that dictate what I can do, and for me to rethink what the table could be is an impossible task. I can go in LRCs, and actually I could come up with a completely radical thing, right? There's something very interesting happening in countries like Chile, like Mexico, that don't have a tradition of over-regulation, and I don't mean regulation as a negative thing, but regulating the right kinds of things. The second thing that's happening in these countries is an accumulation of wealth in Chile because of the mining industry, and a whole generation that went abroad and got highly educated and is bringing back home new concepts and networks. We have the convergence of freedom to experiment with resources, with smarts. And I think there is a real challenge going on between Europe and South America, for example, is who is going to redesign these systems that are challenging us? Will we actively make decisions to change the trajectory and make the future not just a continuation of the past, but design a new future for ourselves? Or then it will be countries like Chile that have the freedom, the resources, and the smarts to come up with the future education system. And we will be adopters. The relationship will be inverted. So I think we don't need to think in terms of countries, but in our work, in our institutions, can we create lowly regulated environments? Environments where we have the freedom to rethink things. And this goes to the core of many deep issues. Right? It goes to cores about values. Do we allow a group to have freedoms when we're an equitable society? Everybody has to be the same. Right? But I think the challenges of Europe is, can we create low-regulated environments that have the resource and the smarts and the freedoms to experiment on behalf of the greater good? Thank you.